Hello and welcome back to the SNG Barratt workshop. My name is Peter Stant and I'm just going to be doing a little bit of tinkering with our XK8, getting it ready for winter use, just picking up a few things before it gets too cold. What we have is a rattle on the rear suspension, which isn't the usual lower bush on the damper. It's actually inside the damper, so I'm going to change the suspension dampers now. Well, this is the damper that I'm going to change. It comes with the bush already fitted and it has the top foam bushes as well, so there's nothing else to buy on this particular part. A bit of a fiddle to fit, but if you go through it carefully, it's not too much of an issue. I've got the car jacked up at the back. It's safely on axle stands. I wouldn't ever work under a car just on a jack. It just isn't safe. I've picked up a couple of good points under the car that are nice and safe. Axle stands are good and strong, so I'm quite happy to roll around under the car. I'm actually working on a ramp, but you could do this job on the floor if your axle stands go high enough. So first thing I need to do is to take the wheel off. We're up in the air, so I've put the handbrake on. Ideally, you'd slacken all of the wheel nuts before you jacked it up, but I've cheated. So we'll go as we are. Just make sure you've got the locking wheel nut tool to hand. Now the wheel's out of the way, I'm going to take the caliper off and just push it to one side so that we don't strain the flexible hose while we're working on the suspension. So the two sliders are removed and I can actually just pull the caliper out of the way, and I'm going to hang it just there. Before I get under the car, I'm just going to disconnect the ABS sensor wire, just so that we don't catch it and strain it while we're working underneath. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to take the bottom plate off the suspension. I'm going to take the whole plate off because it makes it a little bit easier to get the spring out, because obviously we need to remove the spring to change the damper because it's all one big lump. You can do it without dropping this bottom plate off, just by undoing the center row of bolts and actually forcing it down. But I want to look at the state of the bushes as well, either side. So I'm going to kill two birds with one stone, take the whole thing out of the way. These bolts can be very tight, hence the big bar. The bolts are coming undone fairly easily. One of the reasons for that is that I've been anointing this car for several weeks underneath with release oil wherever I've needed to undo. I've given it a good soaking, and it pays dividends, because the last thing you want is a bolt to break off in the chassis. And they're coming undone really quite nicely. Now, before I undo too many bolts underneath, I'm just going to support the lower cradle just to take the weight. The whole rear axle isn't going to fall out, but the cradle is quite heavy, and it's just better to support it. In this case, it's a transmission jack, but if you're working on the floor, you could use an ordinary trolley jack just the same. One thing to remember is that we've got the ride height sensor mounted on the lower frame, so I just need to relieve that before we drop the frame off. Right, well, that's 16 bolts removed, and they were all tight, but it's worth it because it does give that much better clearance to get the spring and damper assembly out of the way. There we go. It's actually not that heavy once it's free. I'm going to take a look at the bushes on that in a little while, but just at the moment it's given me then free access to get to where I want to be to free off the damper. Next thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to drop the two nuts off the bottom of the anti-roll bar, just so that the two parts of the suspension aren't going to be fighting each other when I'm wrestling with them later. Okay, that's nice and free. So the next stage is to remove the four nuts that are holding the top plate of the spring into the body. Now, what I've done, I've put a little trolley jack under the arm just to take the weight. It won't go far, but at least it's going to be supported. I've actually put a couple of cable ties around the spring and the top plate to keep the whole thing together, so it's easier to remove when I take the whole thing out of the car. So the last thing that we need to do before we lift the damper unit out is to remove the bottom pin. Now, this is going to be tight, so you need some decent tools, quality stuff, not cheap stuff, because you'll end up losing your knuckles if you're unlucky. Oh, God. So that hasn't done too badly, and in actual fact the pin is free in the arm, which is quite unusual. Sometimes you find that pin, this pin here, is seized into the lower bush, and really the only way to get around that is to grind the bottom off the bush. It destroys the damper, of course, but then if you're changing it, it doesn't matter. But it does mean that you save the pin. So I count myself very lucky. Before we can remove the spring and damper assembly, I just need to drift that bottom pin out, and then it'll be free. The next thing I need to do, just to help me get the whole thing out, I'm going to push the damper up inside the spring. It's filled with gas, so you do need to push it hard, and if you let it go, it'll come back down again. So I just need to wedge it by putting the bolt back through between the spring coils, and then the whole thing will hopefully fall out as a unit. Okay, so after a bit of a wrestle, I've pinned the damper up to the spring. The whole thing is now complete and hopefully free assembly. If I let the jack down, it'll come down to a point where I can actually extract the spring and damper without too much difficulty. So after all that puffing and blowing, the spring assembly with the damper is now ready to come out, I hope. And there we have it. There's the whole lump together. The new damper comes with all the correct buffers for the top, so we don't need to get those. There's one in there which I've got a replacement, and we'll just change all that. Well, I've stripped the old damper out of the upper support. Nothing to see here, but I know it was rattly, so it's got to be changed. These upper bushes sometimes break up, and that'll cause a knock, but they're all right in this case, but I'm going to go back in with new because they're part of the damper. I fitted the new damper to the top mounting. The damper comes supplied with new bushes, so those have all gone in. Everything's good and tight now, and hopefully that's the end of the rattle. All I've got to do now is to put it back together. The old top spring mounting it's a bit discoloured, but it isn't too bad. But I've already got hold of a new one, so I'm going to put that in. I don't want to do this job twice. Just to help me put it in, I'm going to compress the damper against the gas pressure inside it. Just makes things a little bit easier when you come to put it all together. Oh, go on. It's quite important to get the position of the spring aligned with the top. It's a bit of a struggle afterwards. You can still do it, but if you do it now, it'll drop into place. There's a little bit of a ridge on the casting of the arm, and it has to slot into that. And there's a little rubber ring below that as well that you need to make sure is in good condition before you put the whole thing back together. Right, so that's resting into position. I've just got to basically bolt it back up. But before that, I'm just going to nip off the two cable ties that I put in earlier, because they'll end up trapped if I don't do it now. A little bit of a pump with the jack. And that's aligned on the 4 studs in the body, and I can put those nuts back on. So the 4 top nuts are secured. We just need to put the big bolt in the bottom, and then everything is a little bit more stable. Okay, so that's the big bottom pin back in with its fat washer and one new nylock nut. This bottom pin, 19 Newton meters, so that's FT in my scale. Okay, everybody's happy. Well, that's the spring secured. Just going to put the bottom plate back on and drive away. It's a straight replacement of what we did taking off. So that's the whole thing back together. Bit of a fiddle, but not too much of a struggle, except of course you wouldn't replace just one damper, you'd replace a pair. So I've got to do exactly the same thing on the other side. Well, although I've been working on an XJ8 is very similar. In fact, a lot of Jaguars have a very similar system. So this method applies to a lot of Jaguars of this age. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. There are plenty more how-to videos on YouTube, so go and have a look.